Lac qui Parle County Historical Museum. My name is Rachel Crowett. I am the Outreach Education Coordinator. Please come on in. Let me be your tour guide. Women's suffrage in Lac qui Parle County and in Minnesota. Women's suffrage was one of the featured topics for the museum's spotlight on local women, women's organizations and activities, and fashion. Throughout this reading will be the reports on women's suffrage that took place throughout the country in Minnesota and in Lac qui Parle County. In addition, we included the styles of the time and items used by women in the workforce in the first half of the 1900s. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in July of 1848. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and a group of local Quaker women. Minnesota women began to pressure the legislature in the 1860s to amend Section 1 of Article 4 of the Constitution of the state of Minnesota to give women the right to vote. What may have been the first petition for women's suffrage was introduced in the Minnesota House of Representatives on behalf of Eva J. Spalding in July of 1866. It was referred to the Joint Committee on Amendments to the Constitution but went no farther. In February of 1870, the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution was ratified. This amendment specified that the vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States for any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Gender was excluded. Minnesota's early women suffragists endured many setbacks in their fight for the vote. Perhaps none was as disappointing as Governor Horace Austin's veto of the 1870 female suffrage bill, the first to pass both the House and the Senate. This bill would have extended suffrage to all citizens, male and female, aged 21 and over. It included immigrants and Native Americans. Women in Minnesota began organizing and lobbying for suffrage throughout the 1870s with marches, rallies, speeches, and appeals to legislatures and the Congress. They were often dismissed, ridiculed, derided, and often abused for their efforts. As time neared for a constitutional amendment concerning women's suffrage in school affairs to be voted upon in 1875, the press, which was the paper in Madison, Minnesota at the time, warned, "It will be well to thoughtfully consider this matter and vote intelligently and seriously. The point gained, the women suffragists will never rest until the full right of suffrage is given to the ladies, and then God knows what might happen. Men of America, be careful of your liberties." Nevertheless, in 1875, the Minnesota legislature recognized women's right to vote in school board elections. This was the first law in Minnesota that allowed women to vote in any capacity. Although this very limited suffrage was extended to Minnesota women, it was met with some resistance. In the 1876 election, the voting in Lac qui Parle County was light. The press reported that the amendment was carried, which spoke well for the intelligence of the voters in thus proving their willingness to give the ladies a fair shake in the matter of school business. Women could now vote for and serve as school officials. In the first election under the new system, a woman was elected to the school board at Lac qui Parle, but declined to serve. She hoped that in the future women would serve if elected, and thus relieve the gentlemen of some of their burdens. In 1883, the voters of Lac qui Parle County elected one of the first 3 women county superintendents of schools in the state, Melina P. Kivley. The local newspapers got involved with the elections by supporting certain candidates. They printed stories about the candidates which were not backed by facts, often rumors, which affected the outcomes for them. Newspaper support for general women's suffrage was modest. The Sentinel, under editor August Rood, proclaimed, "The Dawson women are content to preside over their homes and let the men attend to politics. That as it should be." However, the editors of both the Vidette and a later Sentinel editor did back women's suffrage, under the assumption that women were superior to men in their moral character. Sentinel editor Theodore Christensen wrote, "It can be put down a safe proposition that the average woman is as intelligent as the average man, and that she has a higher conception." Many women, however, wanted to vote in all elections, not just school board elections. Seeing the need for a statewide agency, 14 women formed the Minnesota Women Suffrage Association, MWSA, in 1881. They recruited hundreds of women to join. Its members organized marches, wrote petitions and letters, gathered signatures, gave speeches, and published pamphlets to force the Minnesota legislature to recognize the right to vote. Minnesota was a key player in the national fight for women's suffrage. The state legislature had considered several petitions and suffrage bills in the 1860s and 1870s, but none had succeeded. A more conservative suffrage group was formed, known as the American Woman Suffrage Association, or AWSA. The MWSA hosted the AWSA conference in 1885 in Minneapolis. This brought the MWSA and women's suffrage in Minnesota to the national stage. Pro-suffragists responded that men and women both had much to offer in public affairs, that their different perspectives offered a balance. Speakers at the rally all spoke of the progress made and predicted the movement's ultimate national success. 13 states allowed women to vote in school elections and 3 territories. Minneapolis Mayor George A. Pillsbury spoke at the convention. He questioned the sense of preventing intelligent, native-born women from voting when male foreigners new to citizenship enjoyed the right to vote. Lucy Stone, one of the founders of the AWSA, spoke about the logic of including women's voices in policymaking, particularly on issues concerning women and children. The women at this convention also vowed to continue to lobby the state legislature each year until they achieved suffrage. 65 Minnesota newspapers published weekly suffrage articles. In 1893, the MWSA tried but failed to pass an amendment guaranteeing women's suffrage. For the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the MWSA would try to pass legislation concerning women's suffrage, but would eventually fail. The Western Guard reported in 1909 that the Literary Circle met in Lewisburg, Minnesota, where the women enjoyed a buffet meal. A debate on women's suffrage took place at the town hall after the meal. Suffrage movements were still active in our community. During the 1910s, the suffrage movement picked up momentum again. Clara Uland of Minneapolis became serious about the rights of women, especially voting. In 1914, she organized a parade through Minneapolis of over 2,000 suffrage supporters, which brought women's suffrage renewed attention. The local movement for women's suffrage in Lac qui Parle County slowly gained strength through women's clubs and debating societies. In 1916, women presented 2 papers at the meeting of the Library Literary Society in Madison. Barbara Pecor, a teacher at Dawson High School, and Clara Severson, a teacher at the Lutheran Normal School, were both in favor of women's suffrage. A debate took place on April 9, 1917, at the Madison Opera House on the question, "Shall the right to vote be extended to the women of the United States?" The Guard reported, "The argument was opened for the affirmative by Edward Jacobson, who proved without any further question that the fair sex should be given the ballot. He was followed by Theodore S. Slen, who showed just as conclusively that it would not be a good thing for the women or the country to give them the ballot." After a short recess, the discussion was again taken up. J.H. Driscoll for the affirmative, making an impassioned appeal for votes for women. He was followed by Arthur Lee, who proved by statistics and eloquence that women's suffrage states were really not so well fixed with progressive and humane laws as the states where women were not permitted to vote. The arguments were closed by Edward Jacobson for the affirmative and Theodore Slen for the negative. A march for women's suffrage was held on Main Street of Madison during the Lac qui Parle County Fair in 1916. The parade had been organized by Belle Jacobson and Agnes Opegard. Agnes was asked to speak at the fair, at which she gave some standard arguments for giving women the right to vote. Women who participated in the local suffrage movement tended to be businesswomen, wives of professional men, or the children of these kinds of women. Other women were too busy with work and children. Rural teachers were generally too isolated to participate. The suffrage movement had only a fraction of the force of the Women's Christian Temperance Union movement. During World War I, the suffrage movement had some momentum as the shortage of men on the home front led to increased roles for women. In early August 1918, Grace Randall of the Minnesota Suffrage Association was in Madison to secure names as a petition in favor of votes for women. The federal suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment, was brought before the U.S. House of Representatives on January 10, 1918, and passed the House. The proposal lost by 2 votes in the Senate on September 30, 1918. Therefore, Randall's visit in August was timely, and she was greeted by members of the local suffrage committee. Mrs. Ed Borgendale headed a Dawson committee which went house to house gathering signatures. The movement picked up momentum when the 1919 Minnesota State Legislature passed an act to allow women to participate in primary elections and political conventions. Theodore Christensen wrote, "Each woman of this community should see to it that the family wash on Monday, March 15th does not interfere with her going to the polls to vote at the presidential primary election." Christensen assumed that those to whom he attributed superior moral qualities would vote Republican. On May 21, 1919, the United States House of Representatives passed the amendment, and it was passed by the Senate 2 weeks later. This proposed amendment was then sent to the governor of each state. Each governor submitted the amendment to their state legislature for ratification. When 3/4 of the states ratified it, the amendment would be added to the United States Constitution. Once it was certified, it would become law. The amendment was ratified on August 18, 1919. Minnesota was the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on September 8, 1919. Now they had to wait for 3/4 of the states to vote for this amendment. The women did not sit idle during this time. A district branch of the League of Women Voters was formed in Wilmer on February 3, 1920, even though the women could not vote yet. With the amendment still not certified, female delegates were sent to a county political convention on May 5, 1920. The first 4 women sent to the Republican convention were Mrs. Ed Borgendale of Dawson, Mrs. William Lusk of Riverside Township, Mrs. E. Sage of Dawson, and Mrs. Anna M. Stone of Marietta. A school of political education was held at Madison by the Minnesota League of Women Voters in July of 1920. A county branch of the League of Women's Voters was formed then with Mrs. H.L. Hansen elected president, Mrs. Theodore Christensen vice president, Mrs. Hilda O. Slind second vice president, Mrs. Edwin Jackson secretary, and Mrs. C.E. Peterson treasurer. The Secretary of State certified the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920, and became law. This amendment prohibited the states and the federal government from denying citizens the right to vote on the basis of sex. On October 11, 1920, a school of political education was held at Marietta, featuring talks by Mrs. H.L. Hansen and other speakers. By this time, women officially had the vote across the nation. As you just heard, many women spent years to earn the right to vote in all elections, over 60 years. Fortunately, they did not give up, and their persistence paid off with the passing of the 19th Amendment.
If you are interested in more Lac qui Parle County history, check out the Lac qui Parle County Museum, located in Madison, Minnesota.